We are so excited to be able to have this programming, and we thank the Central Berkshire Fund of the Berkshire Taconic Foundation and the Fairfield Foundation for our funding for all the programming. We welcome feedback from everyone, as always. You will get a post-event survey, and if you have a few moments, it's not long or lengthy. It just has a few basic questions of what you thought and what you would like to see. And if you would ever want to present something yourself, lots of possibilities listed in the survey. I will post the link to our events page in the chat for everybody so you can keep track on our website. And please follow us on Facebook, on Instagram. And if when spring comes, when summer's here, and you are out doing some of this gathering and cooking, and you post it on social media, tag us so we get to see that you're using all your new knowledge and skills that Russ is going to be sharing with us. Okay. If you are not on video and you have more than one person watching, if you could just shoot me a message in the chat so I can keep track of numbers for who's with us. It helps us when we both file for our grants as well as when we file the reports on how the grant usage went. For anyone who turned out not to be able to come, or if you know someone who would have loved it but wasn't available this evening, we have our own YouTube channel now, and we post recordings of all our events at this point. So I will also have that in the chat for everybody. Okay, right now I'm going to turn over the chatting to Meredyth of the Wild and Scenic program.
Hello, everyone. So the Wild and Scenic Westfield River, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with it, but it is Massachusetts' very first designated wild and scenic river. It's administered by a different kind of organization than the other wild and scenic rivers. It's state administered, which means that each of the towns has a rep, and they have a lot more control over how the funding is spent so that we can do some of the small projects. One of the things that came out of COVID is that we had invited Russ along with the Housatonic River Walk to be able to present and do a collaboration, inviting volunteers to go for a walk with him. And when we were going to have to cancel that, Russ and I chatted and we decided to film him, which I'm just so thrilled because I had a wonderful time and we're able then to share it and have it on the website for the Wild and Scenic as well as the Housatonic. I know I'm saying their name wrong. That they have multiple names, the Housatonic River Walk, but it's the Great Barrington. Help me out here, Russ.
Well, the Great Barrington Land Conservancy's Riverwalk project.
Okay, there you go. We are doing a ton of things this year as well. A lot of it's going to be virtual. We will have some things, some trainings and work days. So anyone that would like to be part of the Wild and Scenic Westfield River email list, please feel free to send me an email at westfieldriver@gmail.com and I'll add you to that. It'll also alert you when our bumblebee and native plant video comes out in the next couple of weeks with Amy Pulley and the Wing and a Prayer Nursery and Robert Gregier, who does the Beecology Project. And with that, I pass it off to Russ.
So hi, everyone. I've got my BNRC hat on here. I'm actually talking to you from Arlington, Mass, where I live, but I love the Berkshires and I love to nibble on your landscape. So that's the theme of tonight's talk. And we've got these two remaining videos that we want to show, but it was strongly suggested to me that the most entertaining part of last session's program was me talking live and telling you interesting things about some of these plants. So we're going to intersperse the videos with me showing you a few PowerPoint slides about specific plants and how to prepare them. So let me just pull up my slideshow right now. We'll get into that, and then we will get to the other stuff soon. Okay, so here is the first plant I'm going to talk about. This is stinging nettle, and it is the first plant that I harvest in the spring. So where I'm from in Eastern Mass, I can usually find the plants at this stage the first or second week of April. So you might add a week to that for the Berkshires. And this is actually an ideal stage to harvest the plant when it's about 6 inches tall, because it's tender at this stage. And what I do is I just snip off the top cluster leaves. This right here, that's what I use from each plant. I put that in my bag, and then I bring it home, and then I dump the contents of the bag in some water. So let me, before I get into that, let's talk about the sting of stinging nettle in case you're not familiar with that. So if you've never been stung by stinging nettle, it's not like poison ivy where you find out a day or two later that you got into it. You get stung by stinging nettle, you know right away. But the good news is that the sting rarely lasts more than an hour. And actually there are a couple antidotes to the stinging nettle. So it's actually this little plant right here. Let me just get my pointer to behave here. This little plant right here is actually the cotyledons of some jewelweed plants. So jewelweed will often grow near stinging nettle, and that jewelweed juice is one of the things you can put on a stinging nettle sting to help ease the discomfort. But anyway, stinging nettle is a wonderfully edible plant. And so let's get into the details of that. So I've got that bag of stinging nettle tops, and then I use some tongs, and I, after I've put the nettles, I've dumped the nettles out into like a big bowl of water just to wash them off. And then I'll take the tongs and grab the nettle greens and throw them into the cooking pot with just enough water. So I'm steaming the nettle greens in more or less the same water that's still clinging to the leaves from the washing process. So you put the lid on the top of the pot, and then you steam the nettle greens for about 5 minutes, and they'll shrink a lot and they'll look like that. And then at this stage, you can eat them just plain if you want. They taste kind of like split peas, or you can use them in lots of different recipes. And by the way, the steaming process completely disarms the plant. It makes the sting go away totally. And when that happens, it actually converts the chemical that causes a sting in the raw plant into a protein. So it makes the plants relatively high in protein. Plus, stinging nettles have all kinds of other vitamins and minerals in them, like calcium. It's the closest thing I know of to a vitamin pill in the plant world. So it's a very nutritious plant to eat. So yeah, so after you steam the nettle greens, you can use them just plain, or you can make cream of stinging nettle soup, which sounds like something they might have made on the old Addams Family TV show. And it's very easy. It's just a pureed soup with sauteed potatoes and onions and the steamed nettle greens all thrown into a blender, and you smooth it out, and then you add some, for those non-vegans out there, you add some chicken stock and half, and it's very yummy. And here's another thing you can do with this stinging nettle, is you can make these stinging nettle balls. And this is just the retro spinach ball recipe from the 1950s, where the recipe calls for using Pepperidge Farm stuffing mix to hold it all together. So it's really easy. So basically you take that, and that recipe is on my webpage, by the way, as is, so the recipe for the cream of stinging nettle soup, that's one's in my book. This one's on my webpage. And so it's more or less the spinach ball recipe from the 1950s. And you just substitute an equivalent amount of the steamed nettle greens for the spinach, and it works great. And in my book, I've also got a recipe for wild green spanakopita. That's the Greek spinach pie with the phyllo dough and the feta cheese. And the steamed nettle greens work really well in that too. All right, one more plant, and then we'll go to the first video. This guy right here, this is probably one of the most hated plants on earth because it is extremely invasive. Once it gets established somewhere, it's really hard to eradicate. The Riverwalk folks did an amazing job of controlling this plant. So it just pops up every now and then in a little, like 1 or 2% of its former habitat. So they really controlled it very effectively. But it's a kind of plant you have to use eternal vigilance on to keep it under control. But my attitude about invasives like this one, that's very tasty, as I'm about to tell you, is that, if the ecologists or, folks working in landscapes like the Riverwalk Project, if they're going to try and eradicate this plant, I say let's all get out of their way and let them do that important work. But in the meantime, in all the other places where this plant is popping out in the landscape, I say eat it. It's not an effective control measure, by the way. You're never going to wipe out a knotweed patch by eating it because it's a very prolific plant. But you might as well enjoy eating it. So in fact, the chapter on Japanese knotweed in my book, the subtitle of the chapter is "If you can't beat it, eat it." All right, so what parts do you eat? So in the spring, so this is about 3 or 4 weeks from now, you'll see the dried reddish brown bamboo-like stalks in the previous season's growth. And then amidst that, you'll see all these shoots coming up that look like this on the left. We have little red dots on the stem and a cluster of leaves at the top. So this is the stage that I would call the wild asparagus stage. You can just snap that off at ground level, take that whole shoot and steam it for a few minutes and eat it hot or cold like asparagus. But I actually like to harvest this plant a little later stage, which I call the, sorry, I forgot to pop that text up there. All right, so here is little later stage, which I call this the wild rhubarb stage, where the shoots are about 2 feet tall. And they'll cut them at ground level, lop off the top cluster leaves, and then you very carefully peel the outer layer off, just the skin of the knotweed shoots, which is stringy. There's nothing poisonous about it, but it's stringy, so it can get caught in your teeth if you use this for baking and stuff like that. So you trim the outer part off, and then once you've done that, you have this green, crisp green tube, which is tart and juicy, kind of like a Granny Smith apple. And so that's what I chop up and use instead of rhubarb in virtually any recipe calling for rhubarb. So for example, here is my strawberry knotweed pie that virtually everybody I feed this to say, this is even better than strawberry rhubarb pie. So, and the recipe's in my book. And you might be looking at this pie and say, oh, great, well, but I'm a little intimidated by pie crust and that lattice work top. I don't know if I can pull that off. So I'm going to show you a way to use the knotweed that requires no cooking skill whatsoever. You could just take those peeled, chopped up knotweed pieces that are hollow and fill them with like a flavored cream cheese or a salmon mousse or something like that. And then you have these wonderfully tart edible containers, and you have this little appetizer that requires no cooking skill whatsoever to do that. All right, so with that, I'm going to pause in my show and we can do the first video.
I'd like to just interject before the video starts, just to be aware that a number of organizations are starting to manage knotweed or attempt to with chemical sprays. So just be cautious where you choose to gather. Just make sure that you're aware of who the landowner is and whether they're addressing what they see as the problem in that.
Yes, so thank you for adding that, Meredyth. And I should tell you that unless you're there less than a half an hour after the plants have been treated, you will know right away because the plants will look horrible. They'll be all, soft and, all sloughed over and stuff. They just won't look right. And that's actually a general thing I'd advise for any foraging that you're doing. If the plants don't look healthy, if they're stunted or wilted or spotted, there's something off about them. They could have been sprayed with herbicide, as Meredyth is mentioning, or sometimes there's just contaminants in the soil that the plants are adversely reacting to. And I'd like to avoid my exposure to that if I can. So I take my cue from the plants. But, one of the insidious things about knotweed is that it thrives on disturbance, and our rivers are a major vector of disturbance just because of the high water in the spring tends to scour the riverbanks, and that will dislodge bits of the knotweed rhizome, carry them downstream, and then they'll wash up and establish new colonies. So I don't think it will be hard to find a patch of knotweed that is not being sprayed, that's not in a contaminated area. All right, should we try to run this first video?
Okie doke.
Oh, we do talk about it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Russ Cohen, and here we are along the glorious Riverwalk footpath along the Housatonic River in the scenic town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts in the Berkshires. And we're here this morning to look at the edible wild plants that are growing along Riverwalk. And this is a great place to see and learn about edible wild plants. It's not a great place to actually pick and harvest them, but it's a great place to learn about them All right, I've just popped over on the other side of the fence to point out a couple remnant invasive species along Riverwalk. So since Riverwalk was established, this is going back more than 20 years ago, the folks here have been very good about repressing the growth of the invasives and promoting the growth of the native plants. But the challenge with invasive species is you have to maintain eternal vigilance in order to stay on top of them. Otherwise, they will attempt to sneak back and reestablish themselves. And one of those species that is very true about is this one right here. So this is called Japanese knotweed, which is at or near the top of the ecological blacklist because it's very ecologically disruptive. And I'm happy to say we're only finding a few stems of this species here along Riverwalk because this is a persistent problem along rivers throughout the Northeast. And one of the reasons is this plant takes advantage of a natural phenomenon called ice scour, where in a typical river system during the winter, the rivers freeze up, and then in the late winter, early spring, as the ice begins to thaw, big chunks of ice will flow down the river and tear into the riverbank and disrupt it. And the knotweed exploits that opportunity because this plant primarily spreads vegetatively through its rhizomes. And a little bit of the knotweed rhizome can get embedded in the bank thanks to the ice scour, and a new population starts there. So that's why knotweed and rivers are an unfortunate combination. But this plant is highly edible and very yummy. It's beyond the edible stage right now, as I talked to you at the end of May. The right time to harvest this plant to eat it is from late April into early May. And what I'm harvesting are the fat sprouts of this plant. So the best place to look at if you're going to harvest it to eat it is in a patch where you're seeing many, many stems of last year's growth, and it will look reddish brown and they'll look like bamboo, like dried bamboo. This plant isn't related to bamboo at all, though. It's actually related to rhubarb, and it tastes like rhubarb, which I'll get to in just a second. So in a spot where you're seeing all the dried stalks from the previous year's growth, look for a bunch of shoots coming up. And the shoots will be about 1.5 feet tall at the right stage for harvesting, and they'll have little red dots on the stem. It shows up a little bit here. And then a cluster of leaves at the top. So you won't see any leaves at all on the stalks at the right stage for harvesting. And I wouldn't bother to harvest a skinny little thing like this. I'm looking for stalks that are at least 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And they'll be very soft and pliable at that stage. And so you just cut them off at ground level and then lop off the top cluster leaves, and then you have a stalk about this long. And then what you would want to do is peel the outer layer off, which is stringy. So there's nothing poisonous about it. It's just that skin can get caught in your teeth. So take that bit off, and then you'll have this peeled hollow tube, which you can eat right on the spot if you want. It's tart and juicy, kind of like a Granny Smith apple, or you can chop it up and use it instead of rhubarb in virtually any recipe calling for rhubarb. So in my foraging book, I've got a recipe for strawberry knotweed pie that virtually everybody I feed that to prefer over strawberry rhubarb pie. It's that good. And if you don't want to be challenged by making a pie with the pie crust and the latticework top and all that stuff, you can just stew the knotweed pieces like you would stewed rhubarb. So any way you use rhubarb, you can use the knotweed. So, and this plant has medicinal values too. There's a chemical in the, particularly in the rhizomes, called resveratrol, that herbalists will extract from the rhizomes and make tinctures from it and treat people with Lyme disease and other ailments. And it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise in. I just want to share that information with you so that you know. So very bad news ecologically, but may have some other values to the plant, which is good to know. All right, then also another invasive species we're finding here along the riverbank. I gathered some Dame's rocket on the other side of the fence, which is not something anybody else should do. I just did it for the purpose of being able to show this plant and teach it to you. Here at Riverwalk, we encourage people to stay on the trail and enjoy the foliage from the trail. So anyway, this is a non-native, actually an invasive plant called Dame's rocket that was planted in people's gardens, and it's escaped from cultivation, and you often see it growing wild along rivers. And this particular specimen I gathered is kind of purpley in color, but you'll also see a white version of this, and often the white and the purpley versions are growing right next to each other, so it makes this plant very easy to identify at a distance. So while the entire part of this plant is edible, I tend to just eat the flowers because it's fun to eat flowers. And although, as I said, this plant comes in a purpley color and white color, I tend to just use the purple colors because purple flowers are a funner color than just white flowers. So you can just eat these straight off the plant into your mouth, and they have a sweet, garlicky, radishy flavor. They're quite nice. So you could use these right into salads just like that, or you could use these to decorate other foods. And you can even take a flower cluster like this and stick it in some water in a little vase or glass in your refrigerator, and they should keep for several days without going bad. Or you could just throw them into a plastic bag and serve them later. So they won't wilt right away. And so as this is an invasive species, this offers a guilt-free foraging opportunity. You don't have to worry about adverse ecological implications of picking it. Now, you could say, well, it's a pretty flower and maybe I shouldn't pick it because other people like to look at it. And I guess you could say something about that. But as far as ecologists are concerned, they'd be thrilled if you picked and ate as much of this plant as you possibly could. So when I teach this plant, Dame's rocket, to people, I often hear someone chime in and say, oh, that's phlox, isn't it? And it actually isn't phlox. And there's an easy way to tell Dame's rocket apart from phlox if you know what to look for. All phlox family flowers have 5 petals. You'll see that these have 4 petals. This is actually a member of the mustard family. So it's related to garlic mustard and wintercress. And I'm happy to tell you there are no poisonous members of the mustard family that grow in New England. And so as long as you're sure it's a mustard family plant, it's okay to eat. And I really enjoy these Dame's rocket flowers just raw, straight into your mouth, or put into salads or used for decorating other foods. They're quite good. Now let's add this to the compost pile. So I wouldn't do that with garlic mustard, by the way. Yeah.
Bag it and keep it
Right,
separate. Yes.
right. Dame's rocket, though, it's
Yes.
okay. I have been leading walks here for many years talking about the edibility of plants and talking about edible weeds and invasives as well as natives, but this has been an excellent showpiece to show off native plants. And this is a place where people can walk and appreciate the plants. So I hope you've enjoyed this little excursion we've had along Riverwalk with me this morning and learned a few things about these edible plants that we've encountered along the way. And I hope that we'll be able to get together in person sometime and do some more wild edibles here along Riverwalk in Great Barrington, or some other spot along some other river in the future. So thank you very much.
All right, shall we just, unless there's any immediate questions right now, I will plunge into some more slides.
Great.
All right, we're good. All right, let me share my screen and get this open again. Okay, so the nettles and the knotweed are springtime edible foraging opportunities. The next one, it's more of a June foraging opportunity, so it's a little bit later in the season. And this is the plant that produces the round burrs that get caught in your socks in the fall. And the guy who invented Velcro did get the idea from these burrs, by the way. There's a plant logically called burdock. And it is a wonderfully edible plant. Not the burrs, but just about the rest of the plant is edible. I'm going to talk about 2 particular parts that I like. So burdock is a biennial plant. That means it has a 2-year life cycle. So this is what it looks like at the beginning of the second year, but it also looks like this during most of the first year, where you just see these enormous leaves that look a lot like rhubarb. But if you look at the underside of these leaves, you'll see that they're finely woolly, whereas rhubarb leaves are smooth. And also the petioles that you'll see in a later slide, which are the leaf stalks, they are green or green streaked with a little purple, and they have ridges on them like a celery stalk, whereas rhubarb stalks are smooth and reddish. So that's another way to tell them apart. The plants aren't related at all. This plant's much more closely related to dandelion and artichokes than it is to rhubarb. Anyway, so at this stage of the plant, this is one of the times when you could harvest the root, because these plants develop an enormous taproot between the first and second growing seasons. Unfortunately, you can't just grab the rosette, grab the foliage and yank on it and get a root out that way, because they'll usually break on you. So you have to dig the roots out, which is a lot of work. And the roots are very, very long. So I pretty much guarantee that your patience will give out before the root does. Is you'll be digging and digging, at some point you say, oh, the heck with it, and you just slice off what you have. And you might have a length of root that's a foot long, and it kept going. So anyway, what do you do with the root at that point? You could just wash it off, get all the dirt off. You don't have to peel it, just slice it crosswise in about 1/2 inch thick rounds and boil it in salted water till it's tender, which is about 15 minutes. And then it will taste like a starchy artichoke. And herbalists really like burdock, and they think that most of the value medicinally is in the root. But there's another part that I like to eat that's just as tasty and much easier to gather. So let's talk about that one. So what happens in the one I just showed you is, if you don't yank it up and you leave it on the ground, you're going to see that let me just hide the video, floating media controls. There we go. All right. So you see that a second year plant develops this cylindrical flower stalk in the center of the plant. And so this is my favorite part to eat on the burdock. So you just slice that off at ground level, lop off the top cluster leaves, and there's your next edible part. So I collected all these burdock flower stalk in less than 1/2 an hour. So the picking is much faster than digging, much easier on your back. Now you do have to peel the outer layer of these burdock stems because they're bitter and stringy, so you have to peel that part off. But unlike the knotweed, these stalks are solid all the way through. So even after you take a lot of the outside part off, the inner part, it's like a giant elongated artichoke heart. And burdock and artichokes are related. So once you peel the stalks, you can just chop them up and boil them in salted water till they're tender, which is only about 5 minutes. And then it's delicious vegetable, just plain, or it's really good thrown in spaghetti sauce, or it's really good in the recipe that I bet most of you have eaten, some of you probably even made it, where you take artichoke hearts and Parmesan cheese and mayonnaise and breadcrumbs, and you mix it all together and you bake it in the oven, and it's a spread that you put on crackers. Well, you can substitute the boiled burdock flower stalk rounds for the artichoke hearts in that recipe. It works great. And there it is. And this recipe is on my webpage on the recipe link that I included in the chat. All right, so we'll do one more. This is another late spring wild edible. This is black locust. This is technically an invasive species in Massachusetts. So it's another guilt-free foraging opportunity. And don't let the bumblebee in the center of the photo deter you from harvesting these flowers. You might say, oh, I don't want to take flowers away from pollinators. These trees get to be 30, 40, 50 feet tall. And when the flowers are blooming, the trees are covered from top to bottom with the flowers. So the pollinators can fly into the upper branches and visit those flowers. And you can harvest the flowers in the lower branches. And there's plenty of flowers to go around. So these flowers smell like jasmine and they taste like sweet pea pods. So it's fun to just stuff your face right by the tree. Or you can strip the flowers off their central stems and you could just add them to salads, or you can make something with them. And so far, my favorite thing to do with them is to make fritters with them. So here's black locust fritters. This recipe's in my book, and they're not hard to make, and they're really yummy. And there's perhaps by Memorial Day weekend, when the black locust flowers are around, it will be safe again to have friends over for brunch. And if so, this is a really fun thing to feed them. And there is a woman who is participating in this show tonight. You know, she's just watching, she's not actually talking, but I saw her, and that's Blanche Derby. And I have to give her credit for the next thing I'm about to teach you, because you might be saying, oh, black locust fritters, I can't wait to serve that to my cousin or my friend, but they're not going to be visiting me until August or November. So how do I make the fritters for them? Well, you can just make the fritters and then freeze them. That works. But another technique, and this is what I learned from Blanche, is you can just gather up those flowers, strip them off their central stalks, the raw flowers, and freeze the raw flowers, and then make the fritters from the frozen flowers. And those fritters will taste at least as good as the ones that were made from the raw flowers. All right, last one, and then we'll go back to the second movie. All right, so milkweed, and I'll talk about the ecological significance of milkweed in a second, but let me just mention that milkweed is, there's a chapter on milkweed in my book, as there is for black locust, and the subtitle of the chapter for milkweed is A Procrastinating Forager's Dream Food, because there's at least 4 edible stages to the plant, and they happen chronologically in succession, so if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage shows up. So this is actually edible stage number 3, the flower buds. When they're in a tight cluster like a broccoli floret, you can eat them. And by the way, I use the same cooking method for every part of milkweed I eat. And whatever part I'm gathering, I boil for 7 minutes. And that is a totally safe way to eat the plant. So whatever trace amounts of toxins that are in there that could potentially harm you, they're totally dissipated. And then milkweed is a delicious vegetable. And so let me go to the next slide. So these flower buds in this bowl here, these have been cooked for 7 minutes, and look how well they hold up to all that boiling. If anything, they look even nicer than they did on the plant. And so, yeah, you could just eat these just plain, just like this as a side dish, but a really fun way to use them is in this recipe, which is also my book, called Milkweed Egg Puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole. So, so that's a good way to use them. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the ecological significance after I show you about the pods. So milkweed pods are edible too. When they're young, when they're about 1 inch long, after about that, they're not quite as good. And boil them for 7 minutes, and then the flavor and the texture is quite similar to green beans. Okay, so here is our monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us that, yes, this is one of our native milkweed species that the female monarchs seek out as they're migrating from the wintering grounds down to Mexico to lay the eggs on. And then the caterpillars hatch from the eggs and eat the milkweed leaves and so on. So it is really important for us to have lots of milkweed in the environment so the butterflies have no trouble finding the plants to lay their eggs on. So this is a plant I propagate in my nursery, and I grow from seed. And I'm just going to show you how you yourself in your own yard can create a little milkweed habitat for, and also some sources of food for you too. Okay, so here we go. Here is my driveway in Arlington, Mass. So that's my car with my little poke boat on top. And here's our patch of blueberries growing next to the driveway. And we put in some milkweed plants here, and they thrive in that spot. And this is a plant that is very robust. It's kind of like asparagus, is you could just crop it several times and not worry about wiping it out, because it just comes back and comes back and comes back, which is really good. So, as soon as it starts coming up in the spring, I harvest the shoots, which is the first edible stage of the plant, and I boil them for 7 minutes. You have this delicious vegetable, and so I've even dug up dozens of plants from the same spot and potted them up and then planted them in other places that don't have milkweeds, and still they come. They're, as I say, very robust plant. So anyway, so I keep doing this until when I know the monarchs have arrived in my area. And how do I know that? If I don't see any monarchs, I go to a website called Journey North, which is a citizen science reported project where people track the northward migration of the monarch butterflies from their wintering grounds in Mexico on a nationwide map. And so you just go to that website periodically and see where are the butterflies. And so when they start arriving in Massachusetts is when I stop harvesting the plants and just let them grow out and make them available for the butterflies. And yes, so the butterflies are finding my plants. Here's the netting we put over our blueberries, but that doesn't deter the butterflies from laying the eggs on the leaves. And yes, the caterpillars munch on the plants. And we know that because here's a chrysalis attached to our garage door next to our driveway. And fortunately, it attached itself in a spot where the door went up and down. It didn't disturb the chrysalis. So it just happily metamorphosed there. And one day we came out and the butterfly had flown the coop and was off, living its adult life. So so you can have your milkweed shoots, and the butterfly can have its plants too, and we both can share. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and unless there's any other questions, burning questions right now, we can go to the second video.
I did have one question. When you're collecting the flowers from the black locust that you said was invasive,
Yes.
you have to do that in any particular way so that you're not spreading seeds?
Oh, okay. So the flowers can't propagate the plant. The flowers are just what the pollinators visit. So, you don't have to worry about spreading the plants by picking any flowers off the plant. Even if you put the flowers in the compost pile, it's not going to grow any black locust plants. You can relax totally about that.
And the knotweed?
Oh, so some people say, oh, knotweed will sprout from the stems. I have never seen it, never. And I put many, many knotweed stems into my compost pile, and I don't even have a good compost. It's just basically a heap of, yard clippings from our yard and stuff from, vegetable clippings from our kitchen and stuff. It doesn't even get particularly hot. It's just a pile of stuff. I don't even have a proper, composter to put it in. And yet the knotweed has never sprouted there. And I've been doing this for over 25 years. So I think knotweed is safely compostable. But, the key is don't ever harvest any roots of the plant. It's disturbing the roots. That's how the plant is very successful in reproducing. But I don't worry about the stems. So, and by the way, I'll give you one tip, since Meredyth asked, when do you pick the flowers? So you want to give each flower cluster a sniff before you pick it. And you want it to have that really strong, sweet jasmine-like smell. That's going to be a good one. If it doesn't have that smell, it means the flowers are too young or too old, and they're not going to taste particularly yummy. So the smell is a good indicator of a yummy flower cluster.
Okay. Russ, I think one of the attendees has a question.
Sure.
Mr. Garner.
He's muted.
No, it wasn't me.
Oh. Anyone else? All right, well, hearing nothing, let's go to the second video, and then I'll be back after that with more slides.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Russ Cohen, and here we are along the glorious Riverwalk footpath along the Housatonic River in the scenic town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts in the Berkshires. And we're here this morning to look at the edible wild plants that are growing along Riverwalk. And this is a great place to see and learn about edible wild plants. It's not a great place to actually pick and harvest them, but it's a great place to learn about them. And you'll see some familiar plants that you'll know from your own neighborhoods, perhaps growing in your own property where it would, of course, be okay to harvest and eat them. This is a planted tree, but there's many
Whoops.
wild cousins of the same species growing along Riverwalk. This is a somewhat unusual tree species called a hackberry. And one really fun thing about the hackberry is the wardiness of the bark, which shows off fairly well here where you have these ridges sticking up. And that's quite unusual. On this particular tree, it shows up somewhat, but I've seen other hackberry trees where it's even more dramatic. So it's a fun landscape tree to have to look at, even if you didn't eat the fruit. So that's one thing to look for when you're trying to figure out if you have a hackberry tree. The other thing is, if you look at the leaves, you'll see the leaves are asymmetrical. So you see how they're crooked like that? And so I look for that too. And the edible part on a hackberry is the fruit. So what you want to look for at this time of year is a shiny small green ball on a little stem coming out from the twigs of the hackberry. And that's a developing fruit, and it will be ripe in the fall, and sometimes it will persist through the winter. And it will get probably about 1/4 inch in diameter, or maybe slightly less. And then the color will be a sort of a reddish brown color on the outside. And hackberry has two edible parts. So the very outer layer of a hackberry fruit is very sweet and it tastes like a date. So that's really fun. And you can nibble that part off, and then in the very inside of the hackberry is this starchy seed, which is also good tasting. But in between the two layers is a shell, and it's not like an M&M candy shell. It is a shell, like a shell that you find on a nut. It's thin, and you can actually bite through it with your teeth, and that's certainly possible, but I wouldn't say that that is going to appeal to most people because our palates are kind of spoiled with having, you know, seedless grapes and seedless raisins and stuff like that. So we're not used to eating fruits that have shells in them. But that did not deter the Native Americans at all. They certainly would eat the outer part, eat the inner part, and pound it all together and eat everything together, and that was fine. But hackberries are fun for nibbling the outer part off, certainly even if you don't break the shell with your teeth and eat the inner part. Just nibbling the outer part is quite good. And I have gathered hackberries from wild trees and propagated little hackberry trees in my nursery. And my trees are still rather diminutive, but I hope in a year or two that they'll be big enough for me to be able to start planting out in the landscape and diversifying sites that don't have them. Here at Riverwalk, there's quite a few, but it'd be fun to get some hackberries growing in places that don't have them because it is a somewhat unusual tree species. It's going to come around the edge of the railing here to look at another one of our native wild mints. How to recognize members of plants in the mint family. You look for the opposite leaves growing across from each other, and you look for the square-sided, 4 equal-sided stem that you can feel by twirling it in your fingers. And when I mentioned the wild bergamot, I was talking about how mints fall into 2 basic categories, the culinary categories, the sweet mints and the savory mints. And I would place this into the sweet mint category because if you scrunch up a leaf and sniff it, it has a sharp pepperminty type flavor. So this one you could use for making mint tea, mint julep, mint ice cream, mint candy, stuff like that. And this is the Pycnanthemum muticum. So when this one blooms in the summer, the flower isn't that showy, but I would have to say out of all the species I know of, the flowers of the Pycnanthemum muticum attract more interesting pollinators than anything else that I have deployed in the landscape or have propagated in my nursery. So if that is something that would interest you to plant a pollinator-friendly plant that you could eat too, this Pycnanthemum muticum, the broadleaf, or sometimes called the clustered mountain mint, would be an excellent choice. All right, let's go back along the walk and see what else we could find. Well, actually, we're getting a clue right here from seeing some nutshells along the pathway here. So nutshells like this are likely to be butternut shells. Usually when you see it more egg-shaped with a little point to it, that's the typical shape of a butternut. If this were spherical and round, it would be a black walnut. These are 2 closely related species in the Juglans genus, and they're both edible. So it isn't really critical to know which one you have because either one is fine. So here's a tree with a label on it. So this always makes it easy when you see that. So black walnut trees have compound leaves. So if you look up into the tree, you can see the leaflets like sumac that we saw before. We have one leaf and then a whole bunch of leaflets coming off of it. And if we come over here, let's see if I can reach up. I'm going to stand on the railing and see if I can jump up and grab a leaf. Yes, okay. And bring that down. So one of the ways you can distinguish black walnut and butternut is if you just scratch the stem of the leaflet and give it a smell, you often get a very spicy fragrance. And that smell is the same as the smell on the husk that surrounds the nut that'll be ripe in, for butternuts it's September, for black walnuts it's October. And as I said before, the difference between black walnuts and butternuts when the nuts are ripe is that black walnuts are egg-shaped and, Black walnuts are round and butternuts are egg-shaped. And the butternut, the nut inside the butternut, is relatively mild, and then the black walnut is relatively assertive, but and strongly aromatic, but they're both edible. And I wouldn't say that black walnuts are that good for eating just plain, but they're really good mixed with honey in various baked dishes, like black walnut baklava is really good. And so here we are. So this would be a tree that you would look for nuts to fall underneath. Once again, if it were a butternut, it would be September, and if it would be a black walnut, it would be October. And you'll see, if it were black walnuts, they look like old green tennis balls just piled up underneath the tree. And you can gather those, and what I typically do is stomp on them to get the husk, as much of the husk off as I can. And then we'll hose off the remainder from water with my rain barrel at home. And then for the nuts I want to grow trees from, I store them in a plastic bag in the fridge until I sow them. And the nuts I want to eat, I allow them to dry for about 6 weeks. And drying the nut is a great way to facilitate separating the nut shells from the nut meats, because the nut inside the shell will shrink a little bit. And so when you crack the nuts open, the pieces will fall out of the nut shells better than a fresh nut, because a fresh nut, it's hard to separate the nut meat from the shell. All right, let's see what else we can find. Okay, so here along the edge of Riverwalk in a gravel parking lot, we're encountering this species right here, and this is called pineapple weed. And when I teach this to people, a lot of people say, that's chamomile, isn't? And they're sort of right, because this is a close wild relative of chamomile, and you also use it to make tea. So what I'm going to do is just pull this plant out, and then we'll take it off to the shade. But first, let me just tell you, you see that the ground is very gravelly right here where this plant is growing, and that is very, very common. As I typically see this plant growing in very poor gravelly soil. That is its habitat preference. And although it is a native species to the Pacific Northwest, it's not native to New England. And it's a plant that has a very cosmopolitan range now, so it's naturalized in Europe and places like that. But wherever you find it, you typically see it growing in this very gravelly soil. Okay, so let's take this plant into the shade where I can talk to you about it more. All right, so once again, this plant is called pineapple weed. And the reason is because of its flavor. So this is a flower right here. It never gets any petals. So that's one way to tell it apart from chamomile, because chamomile flower would have the white petals coming off, and this plant never produces any petals. And the whole plant has a pineapple-y flavor, but it's most pronounced in the flowers. So that's what I typically suggest people focus on. So to know for sure that it's pineapple weed, is what you would do is just squeeze the flowers and give it a sniff, and it will smell like canned pineapple. And so you make a tea from this plant just by picking the flowers off and steeping it in hot water for a few minutes, and then you get a very nice flavored tea, which tastes like what you smell like when you pinch the flowers. And I don't know if this has any of the same medicinal properties as chamomile tea. It may, I just don't know. But it is a fun plant to make tea from. And around now, the end of May, as we're filming this, is when I typically see this plant at this stage. So it should be around for another several weeks, and then by midsummer it will be gone. But this is a good time to gather it to make the tea from, pineapple weed. All right, let's see what else we can find here.
So here at Riverwalk, we work to diversify our habitat with a variety of plants, and we really try to go for local natives. And Russ was so kind yesterday when we were doing some reconnaissance about what we had available for our talks, to bring along some of his own native plants, and we had the help of our Greenager interns to plant them. And so we're really excited to have a few new species at Riverwalk that we'll be working to support to increase the diversity yet again of our riparian habitat. Russ is just watering some of these plants now, and our Riverwalk Greenager interns will be keeping a close eye on them. It's been fabulous to have you here today. Every time you come to Riverwalk, I learn so much more. Your expertise is really wonderful, and the way that you provide your information, not only from the human perspective, but from the pollinators and the birds and other things that are benefiting, is really inspirational.
So I've very much appreciated and treasured my partnership with Riverwalk over the years, because this has been a great project to collaborate with. And this goes back to my days working for the Mass and Fish and Game Department in the Riverways program, which became the Division of Ecological Restoration. And then since I've retired and playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species, I've also had an opportunity to bring some of the plants from my nursery to further diversify what's here at Riverwalk with additional things. So Riverwalk is a great example of a citizen-driven restoration project where they took a rubble-strewn eyesore that was neglected by the town and turned it into a spectacular showpiece by cleaning it up, removing the rubble, removing the invasive species planted with native species, and now it's an asset to the community instead of a neglected area. And this is something that should be replicated throughout not only Massachusetts, but in any place where rivers have been abused. They should be brought back to the beneficial functions that they should be contributing to the communities where they flow. And so here at Riverwalk, it's been great for me because of the particular interest in native plants. And so I have been leading walks here for many years, talking about the edibility of plants and talking about edible weeds and invasives as well as natives. But this has been an excellent showpiece to show off native plants. And this is a place where people can walk and appreciate the plants. And while this isn't really a great place for people to collect and eat plants growing here at Riverwalk, it's a great place to see the plants growing in the natural riparian habitats. And many of these species are very appropriate for people to establish in their own yards. And perhaps they'll get the idea from seeing the plants at Riverwalk that, gee, this plant is nice. It would be nice to have this in my own yard. And then they can establish their own growth there. And of course, once the plant's growing in your own yard, you can nibble on it all you want. So I hope you've enjoyed this little excursion we've had along Riverwalk with me this morning and learned a few things about these edible plants that we've encountered along the way. And I hope that we'll be able to get together in person sometime and do some more wild edibles here along Riverwalk in Great Barrington, or some other spot along some other river in the future. So thank you very much.
All right, so are we ready for a few more slides? So what I wanted to show you first, I just went to my slide collection. I dropped in this slide of hackberry. So you all see this in the upper right-hand corner. So I wanted to show you what ripe hackberry fruit looks like. So there it is. So these are about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, just a little bit short of, so maybe more like a 1/4 inch diameter. And as I said, the outer part is sweet and tastes like a date, and the inner part is starchy. And between the two layers is the shell that you can bite through if you want to, or it's fun just to nibble the outer part off. And I'm not going to talk about anything else here in the slide. I'm going to go on to black and yellow birch. So this grows along Riverwalk, and you can make a tea from the twigs, without any cooking at all. Actually, cooking is not good. You just take the twigs of black or yellow birch. They both have the oil of wintergreen in them, and you just take the twigs and the peelings and just put it in a glass jar and let it sit around for an hour, and that's it. And another thing you can do, and it's probably not too late to do this in the Berkshires, is to tap birch trees. Any tree that's big enough to tap, you tap them just like maple trees. And let me just get rid of this thing here. Hold on just a second. Hide the floating meeting controls. Okay. So yeah, so you tap it just like a maple. Unfortunately, the birch sap is in waterier than maple sap, so you have to boil the heck out of it to get anything. And what you eventually get looks and tastes just like molasses, as you see here in this bottle. But you're not going to save any time or money making your own molasses from birch sap. You probably just want to go to the store and buy molasses. But having said that, if let's say you were camping around this time of the year when the birch sap was flowing, and you were concerned about the potability of the water supplies of the place where you're camping, is you could tap the birch trees and get all the pure, clean drinking water you need that way. And one thing I forgot to say is that birch trees gush compared to maple trees. So when I tapped some birch trees to make this syrup years ago, I was getting a gallon of sap in an hour. So much faster than a maple. So yeah, so it is a practical source for drinking water when the sap is flowing. All right. So, oh, and another fun thing you can do, and we're a little bit late in the season to do this unless we get a weird late, season snowfall, is birch seeds come out of these pine cone-like things called strobles. And really fun thing to do in the wintertime is to look for them on the surface of the snow, and you can pick them off and then put them on some soil, and they'll just start sprouting. They actually need light to germinate. So this is one of the plants I've got lots of in my nursery, just from gathering the seeds off the snow and just spreading it on some soil. And there they go. All right, so sumac. So wanted to talk to you about sumac, and probably you're all smart in the audience and you would never think that this would be poison sumac because you know better. But for the folks that don't know, I show them this slide. That's what poison sumac berries look like. So you've ever been quaking in your boots because of sumac, and it didn't look like this, you were worrying needlessly. So any sumac with these tight upright clusters of red fruit is not only not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. And the main edible part are the berries, and you make a drink from the berries. So I will just explain how to do that. So you pick the fruit off the plant, and this happens to be the staghorn sumac, but you could also use smooth sumac or wing sumac. They're equally good. And then you want to put the berry clusters in a bowl of water and just knead them in the water like you're kneading bread dough. And you're rubbing them, and you're rubbing the flavor off the berries, and you're getting it into the water. The water will turn this pinkish orange color. So once you've done that for a while, just fish the berries out. You're done with them. And then here's your liquid, and you want to pour this through any kind of a filter like a paper towel, just to catch any remaining berries, hairs, anything that's still left in there. And then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. So here is the sumac-ade. And so I drink it, I like it cold and sweetened. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit off the plant to drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. All right, so there's a couple edible species in the Berkshires. I tend to see the other one first. I'll just talk about this one. This one I see less frequently, but this is the one that the Concord grape was developed from. So these grapes get to be very large, like almost an inch in diameter, and the flavor is very similar to our cultivated Concord grape. And so they're fun for just eating right on the spot or making stuff. Yeah, so in a typical year, I'm filling up my baskets with this fox grape fruit. And so this is something my wife made, this fox grape cheesecake, which was really delicious. All right, so the kind of grape species I tend to see more out in the Berkshires is this one. This is called the Riverside grape. And this one also produces grapes, but I don't think they're as yummy raw as the first species I just showed you. These are kind of musky flavored, and these grapes are smaller. I mean, you can still use them for grape jam, grape jelly would be fine. But this species has a use that's better than the fox grape, and it's the young leaves for stuffing to make the stuffed grape leaves recipes. So this is what the Riverside grape looks like in the spring. And one of the ways to tell the leaves are the riverside grape leaves are smooth and green on the underside. The fox grape leaves that I showed you, can I go back? Oh, so you see right here, here's a fox grape leaf I flipped upside down, and it's got finely woolly, and it's often a coppery color by the time the grapes are ripe. Earlier in the season, it's usually white. But anyway, the riverside grape leaves are smooth and green on the underside. And some people I know that make the stuffed grape leaf recipes say that this is the best species to use. And so you gather them in the spring, and then you stuff them, and there's your stuffed riverside grape leaf. So this is another thing that once we're able to have company over, it's really fun to make these, and they'll really be impressed when they find out that they're wild grape leaves that you picked and stuffed yourself. So one last thing I'll say about grape leaves, and some of you may already know this, that if you make pickles and you take a grape leaf, as far as I know, it doesn't matter what kind, and you take a grape leaf and you put it in that same jar that you're putting your pickles in to pickle, those pickles will come out crisper because that grape leaf was in there. And I think it's because of the tartaric acid that's in the grape leaves. That's what cream of tartar is made from. It's an astringent, it's a tightener. And so that's what it does. It tightens the tissues of your pickles. All right, so how are we doing on time? Should we do some more slides, or you want me to wrap up? I'll leave it up to you.
Does everyone want to have a show of hands or comment in the chat? I'm fine with it going on. It's
All right,
wonderful.
so let's at least talk about this one. So this is the black walnut that we did in the video. So this is what the nuts look like when they're still on the tree. And as I described them, they're like old green tennis balls. You do not have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and then they'll look like this. And it's pretty typical in early October to see these just strewn along the roadside or in people's yards and stuff like that. So what I have done from time to time is I'll see some, littering somebody's yard, and I'll go knock on their door, and they'll answer, and I'll say, I see you have some black walnuts. Would you mind if I harvested some? And the typical response I get is, wait a minute, let me get my wheelbarrow and fill it up for you, because these are kind of messy, smelly nuts, and people are sort of eager to get them off their property. And if you're willing to take them, people are happy to give them to you. So, all right, so it is a bit of a challenge to get this part off, because it is messy and smelly, and it can stain your fingers brown if you deal with these with bare hands. It happens to me every year. I don't care, but you might care. So wear gloves if you're going to handle them. And as I mentioned in the video, what I do is I stomp on these in the field and get most of this part off right there without having to take it home. So after you get this outer part off, that's what they look like underneath. So the next challenge is getting these open, because these shells are notoriously hard. They will break most conventional nutcrackers. So you have to use something like a hammer or a rock or a brick or a vise. If you have a vise in your tool shed, that might be a really good way to get it open, because then you're having sort of a controlled explosion as you get them open. I will show you what I use. I use this device I got from a company in Oklahoma that I'm afraid to say I don't think they are in business anymore. But this is a nutcracker specifically designed to work on black walnuts. And it looks like a torture instrument with the Middle Ages, with the teeth here. And what happens is it exerts a tremendous amount of torque on the nut. And finally, the nut explodes from all the pressure, but you drop this metal flange over the nut. And so the pieces just fall into the shell, and you get big pieces out like that. Now, as I said in the video, I'm not sure I'm a biggest fan of just, chawing down on a bowl of black walnuts just plain like that. But when you bake with black walnuts and you mix them with honey, you can get some really extraordinary results. So here's two different dishes I make from black walnuts. So this black walnut baklava, that recipe's on my recipe page on my website. And then this is the one that I make even more frequently, because this is really easy, the black walnut honey squares. And I can't remember if I posted the recipe of this or not. If I haven't, you can write me. I'd be glad to send it to you. But the key is black walnuts and honey together. They're just an excellent combination. All right, so this is the last plant I'm going to talk to you about in this show. This is an invasive species called autumn olive. that isn't that common in the Berkshires, but the more further east you go or south you go from the Berkshires, you're going to run into this plant very frequently. There's a ton of it in Connecticut. There's a ton of it in central and eastern Mass. This photo happens to be taken on an island that the Trustees of Reservations owns in Salem Harbor. But I could have taken this photo many, many other places. So in the spring, when these plants bloom, they have a very pleasant smell. There's a close-up of what the flowers look like. And this is what the berries look like. So this is what you want to target. So it's called autumn olive because it's ripe in the fall. And the berries often fruit prolifically in the branches. So the picking can be really fast. So you want to pick the fruit when it comes off at the slightest tickle. So if you have to kind of yank on it to get it off, it's not quite ripe yet. It should fall just in a very, very gentle coaxing motion. And it doesn't take long to fill up a basket with this fruit. And by the way, autumn olives are edible raw, so there's a close-up of what they look like. You see they have silvery white speckles on the outside of the fruit. So they vary in flavor from bush to bush. Sometimes they're puckery and astringent, and other times they can be very nicely sweet and tart together, kind of like a green Thompson seedless grape, except these fruits have seeds in them which you can swallow or spit out. All right, so here's what I typically do with the autumn olives. I pick. So, put them in the basket, bring them home, and then I will, sort through them, throw in any soft or moldy berries, and then I will dump the contents of the basket into a big pot like a lobster pot. And then I will simmer them for a while, so like that. And then in the meantime, I've gotten this is my food mill in a bowl out. So after I've simmered the autumn olives, then I run them through the food mill, and all the seeds are held back and all the pulp goes through. So you see on the right here, there's all the seeds that the food mill extracted. And then you get this frothy mauve colored puree. And that's the raw material you can use for making autumn olive jam, autumn olive jelly, autumn olive sorbet, autumn olive chiffon pie, stuff like that. And here's what I typically do though. So what I do is I take that puree and I pour it into my food dehydrator. And you have to get the lining in the tray that enables you to pour liquids in, and then pour it in there, and then stack it up. If you picked a lot of berries, you've got enough puree to make multiple sheets here, and just let it run overnight. And then in the morning it comes out all nicely dehydrated, and it's a fruit leather. And I just chop it up into bite-sized pieces like this, and it's really good. And were this to be an in-person slideshow tonight, I'd be feeding you some of this autumn olive fruit leather. And autumn olive does make a great wine. So that's all my slides for the show tonight. So thank you very much. And here's where to find me online. I think that's also in the chat, my email address. I've been mentioning my book a bunch of times. So if you wanted to get it, you can get it directly from the publisher, which is a regional land trust for Essex County, Mass. That's in Northeast Mass. And here's the details of that. And then you could also order it online and get it sent directly to you if you'd rather do that. So with that, I will yield the field here, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Russ, that was phenomenal. I'd been wondering when you mentioned autumn olive, what on earth, how there was something I had never heard of before.
Yes, so it has that name because the foliage is silvery green, sort of looks like olive trees. They're only very, very distant cousins. Okay. So yeah, autumn olive is a sweet fruit. It doesn't really taste like olives at all.
Is its range further north, like all the way to Maine?
Yeah, it'll grow as far north as southern Maine. I've seen it as far as like Meredyth, New Hampshire, near Lake Winnipesaukee, but not really further north than that.
Okay.
But where you're really going to see a ton of it is as you move, as I said, south from the Berkshires down into Connecticut. And one of the reasons is that back in the 60s and 70s, the highway departments planted lots and lots of autumn olive along the roads because the plant does what plants in the pea family does. It can make its own nitrogen fertilizer. And so it loves to grow in the really crappy soil that's left behind after you build a highway. And so, here was a great way for, the highway departments to just revegetate the disturbed corridors where they put these highways in. Now they regret it, of course, because the plant's invasive, but, in the 60s, I mean, even Mass Audubon planted autumn olives in some of their, before they knew. Even the place where I used to work, the Mass Department of Fish and Game, our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, planted autumn olives at some of our wildlife management areas before we knew it was invasive.
Russ, thank you so very much. My husband and I just enjoyed it immensely.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Keep going. We need more.
Yeah, well, that's all the slides I queued up for tonight, and it's already 10 past 8, so I've already worn out my welcome
no,
here.
I mean in the future.
Oh, sure. And yes, so in the chat is the link to find me and the other programs I'm doing. I've got other definitely other online things coming up that are available to the public, and a few groups have actually coaxed me to do in-person programs. And depending upon how things go, we will or we not be wearing masks and socially distancing and stuff. But I did some of those last year, and we were able to pull them off, and it was okay. So we'll do at least that, and maybe you won't even have to wear the mask. Let's hope for that would be good. So. Okay, so somebody's asking about anything special to look for at Canoe Meadows. So one of the spots I would check out, and of course I'd get permission from a gardener first. If I remember correctly, Canoe Meadows has got some kind of a community garden that's not very far from the parking lot, if I'm remembering correctly. So in any kind of a garden setting like that, you're going to find really great, yummy, edible garden weeds. So in the spring, you'd be looking for things like chickweed, which starts coming out, as soon as the snow melts. I'm already beginning to see it germinate in my garden. And then as the season gets a little bit older, you've got lamb's quarters or oh, there's no garden at Canoe Meadows. All right, I'm sorry, I don't remember that correctly. Well, anyway, let me just put it this way. Organic farms are a great place to forage, and you've got them all over the place in Berkshire County. And I don't mean by that comment to deter you in any way from patronizing the farm stand, getting a CSA share and all that stuff, because as many weeds and invasive species there are out there that are edible, there aren't enough to make a significant dent in our food supply. So we really need to grow our food, and organic farming is a great way to do it. But in the meantime, organic farms are great foraging places. So why is that? Well, reason number one is the obvious one. They're not slathering everything with chemicals. So that's good. Reason number two is the way they manage weeds at organic farms. They do it strategically. They're not weeding every square inch of the farm every single day. They weed where they need to, and they neglect the areas that they don't need to weed. So if you time your visit right to an organic farm, you can find huge amount of weeds, enough to feed whole armies. If I've got a big dinner party planned, which I haven't done lately, but hopefully will again in the future, you can go to organic farm and find usually all the raw material you need that way. And then another good reason is the wonderful stuff that's in the living organic soil that makes the organically grown fruits and vegetables so nutritious to eat. All the good stuff is getting into the weeds too. So the weeds that you'd harvest at organic farms are going to be higher in nutrients and yummier and just in better shape than, let's say, weed growing in a crack in the sidewalk. And then the last reason to look at organic farms as foraging opportunities is the edges of organic farms have good edge habitats where there's fruit trees, nut trees, berry bushes, stuff like that. So my advice is form a symbiotic relationship with your local organic farmer, because they have the weeds, you want the weeds, so potentially it's this great partnership. So once again, though, just don't just go there and start picking. You need to talk to the staff there and make sure they're okay with you doing that. Usually they are. In fact, they'll probably save you a tremendous amount of guesswork. So let's say it's the summer and you want to gather some purslane. They'll tell you exactly where the purslane is going, so you don't have to wander all over the farm to find it. And so organic farms is great foraging opportunities. So I'm not looking at the chat, so you'll just have to tell me if there's anything in the chat I should be answering. Oh, Valerie's got a question. Want to unmute yourself, Valerie?
I'm sorry, you're right. I was muted. I think you need to do a baking workshop. I wrote in the chat that I keep thinking about that pie.
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. I have done workshops where a bunch of people and I go out and gather raw materials and then we cook them up, and sometimes there's baking involved or other things that I'm like the milkweed egg puff. That's a pretty easy thing to make with a group. And I just find them to be very stressful because I have to sort of supervise a bunch of people, because we're all going to eat this food and I want to make sure it comes out right. And so I'm kind of running around because we usually like making a half a dozen dishes at once.
Yeah.
And I have to worry about, are we going to be able to find enough raw material to, make the quantities we need for these recipes and stuff like that. And so I tend to just do the easy thing, which I realize is not as useful for some people, is I bake things ahead of time and then bring them to my programs. So it's a little bit hard to share a pie, with like, bringing a pie to a library and sharing it with, 30 people that are in the, function room for a talk. So I'll usually bring something smaller, more portable, like cookies, for example, or those black walnut honey squares. But yeah, it is fun to bake and stuff. And usually when a group asks me if I would do one of these baking classes, I know somebody else that likes to do that more than I do, and so I can just refer them to somebody else.
Mm.
But thanks for the idea.
Jody, do you want to tell us a little bit about where this garden journey is going for the Becket Athenaeum?
You mean the grant that I'm in the process of doing?
Oh, okay. Well, I thought that it was achieved and that you had a plan, so you'll just let it.
Oh, no, we won't know till somewhere around July 1st. I'm applying for a grant to put in an educational garden on the grounds of the library. And the intent is to we already have quite a bit of ornamental perennials, but I want to put in edible perennials, as well as there will be raised beds and elevated beds so that there's handicap accessible, and classes and programs offered for the community, all ages, as well as walking field trips over for the school. The Girl Scouts have committed to some of the labor, which is wonderful. And I'm forging a lot of community partnerships in this. I'm really excited for it. And the consultant who's giving her services to us is Pat Parkins, who owns Gardens of the Goddess landscaping. And she's committed to it to the point that if for some reason we didn't get the grant, she has full intentions of helping fundraise, so we do it regardless. But it'll be an ongoing, multi-year, for good, way of instilling gardening and permaculture and organics, and the idea that all weeds don't have to be pulled. Lots of ideas, but
milkweed, pokeweed, those are native species that are edible and have ecological value as well as, people value.
Yeah, one of my favorite foods on this earth is wood sorrel. Everyone else pulls it, and I'm in my garden practically smacking hands. Don't pull it, because it's divine. No. So yeah, thank you, Meredyth, for pointing that out. We're excited, and it sounds like Parks and Rec is over at the park going to be putting in blueberry bushes, and I'm in talks with the Arts Center and eventually the Mullen House to see if we can have gardens at each place, so it'll be a multi-campus educational garden center.
Wonderful.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Russ, thank you so much for joining us on these evenings. It just makes it so much more present and exciting. Thank you.
Sure. Well, we got a little repetitive on the knotweed there, but other than that, I thought it went very well.
It's fine. We need a little repetition.
I loved the visual of the snacks and food for the knotweed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great evening, and I look forward to everyone's feedback on the survey. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.